January 6th, the date that will always remind us of the insurrection. Thousands who believed the election misinformation spread by former President Trump stormed the Capitol, trying to prevent Joe Biden from taking office.
Morgan Lowe catches us up on how many of the rioters have ties to Arizona and where those cases stand tonight.
January 6th, 2021, the siege of the nation's capital lasted roughly 6 hours. 2 years later, prosecutors have charged more than 950 people in connection to what happened that day, including 15 who have connections to Arizona. USA! USA! The most recognizable figure is likely to be Jacob Chansley, the so-called QAnon shaman. He was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Other charges against the Arizona defendants include civil disorder, obstruction of an official proceeding, assaulting, and seditious conspiracy. Edward Vallejo, a member of the Oath Keepers militia group, is currently on trial for seditious conspiracy. This week, prosecutors filed an exhibit that contains surveillance video. The government alleges it shows Vallejo and other Oath Keepers bringing crates and other bags containing guns and ammunitions through a hotel lobby, hallways, and into a room in a hotel outside D.C. the morning of January 6th. Prosecutors say Vallejo was standing by at the hotel during the riot. They introduced a text message from Vallejo to Oath Keepers leader Stuart Rhodes that reads, "Vallejo back at hotel and outfitted. Have 2 trucks available. Let me know how I can assist." Last year, one of Vallejo's friends defended him in an interview with AZ Family Investigates.
He's passionate about his beliefs, he's passionate about his opinions, he's passionate about helping veterans. And it's a shame that government twisted his words expressing those passions to be used against him to make him seem like a danger.
8 of the 15 defendants from Arizona have either pleaded guilty or have already been sentenced to prison. The remaining 5 Arizona defendants are either awaiting trial or, as in the case of Edward Vallejo, already on trial. I'm Morgan Lowe for Arizona's Family Investigates.
Morgan, thank you.